So this past week, I had been thinking on, usually for prayer meeting, we always have a smaller crowd, right? And I think it's fairly common. But this goes to show us that it reflects that somehow prayer becomes a little bit more of a secondary thought for a lot of us, right? And what reminds me of this is back when I was young, I remember that at one point we were having family dinner, and we were having grapes, and we always loved grapes. And somehow at one point it was, we were all done with dinner, and my sister decides that she was going to have that she was going to get a grape, and she swallowed the grape, so she began choking. And the first reaction that we usually have is, we panic. At that time we're very young, so we panicked. And I remember one thing that my dad told us immediately, and that was, you have to pray. Now at that time, when something is very chaotic, maybe the last thing that you think is, while he was doing, the Heimlich maneuver, the last thing that you would think is to pray, right? And this reminds me that oftentimes whenever we find ourselves in trouble, prayer will usually be, not always, but usually will be our very last resort. When things become desperate and there's really nothing else you can do, then usually this is when we'll remember that, I guess we have a God, and He maybe cares for us, and why don't we just go ahead and pray? So prayer is always is usually a secondary thing, but as we've been talking about it, it's very, very important. And one of the things and the themes that we find throughout the Old Testament and throughout the Bible is that as human beings, we will come to our limits, and then once we come to our limits, that's when God becomes evident. And throughout the Bible, we see that God always wanted to teach humanity that success and the victory never comes because of what you're able to accomplish, but because of what He's able to accomplish through us. And one of the perfect examples that we have is the example of Gideon. When God calls him to a mission, God makes it a point that He's going to take a very small number of men, and this is how they're going to have success. And throughout all, the Israelite story, it's all about what God can do with a very few people. So we're going to go to Psalms. We're going to go to Psalms chapter 20, verse 7 through 8. And it says, "But some trust in chariots and some in horses, but we will remember the name of the Lord our God. They have bowed and fallen, but we have risen and stand straight." We always have a tendency to trust in things that I can see, things that I can actually touch. And I would like us to go to Pharaoh's story in the Old Testament. And I'm always fascinated by his story because God takes him through a journey. And this is a journey of Pharaoh discovering that his gods and what he used to trust in amounts to absolute nothing. And through this series of plagues, some of which are fairly comical, but some we're going to find out that when we look at a bit of the history, it was very terrifying for the Egyptians. So we're going to get a little bit of the backstory from the plagues. Now, if you remember, what is the very first, you could say, miracle that Moses performs? What is the very, very first one? He goes to Pharaoh and he has the what? The rod, yes. So what happens to the rod? He comes before the Pharaoh. Aaron throws his rod and it becomes a snake, and then the snake begins to eat or devour Pharaoh's magicians' rods or snakes. And this right here, this is called, I don't know how you pronounce it, but it's called Ipuwer, which is spelled Ipuwer. And this is, when understanding some of the things some of the archaeological things from Egypt, you usually have to go back and you have to look a lot at their literature because we have to be able to understand their idioms and some of their expressions. And we would do the same thing. We have a lot of expressions that if you were to take them literally would make absolutely no sense. So the very same thing would be done, when trying to understand, in this case, the Egyptian culture. Now, here, I'm going to read just one paragraph from this. Of course, I have no clue what that says, but I have been told that this is the translation. So we'll trust the historians on this one. And this is what supposedly and allegedly this piece of paper says. So we want to get an idea of what that miracle of Aaron's staff turning into a snake and devouring the other snakes actually meant for Pharaoh. And it says like this, it says, "It is Pharaoh who eats their magic and gulps down their ox." Okay? And then it continues to say, the big ones are his morning meal. Their middle-sized ones are for his evening meal. Their little ones are for his night meal. So according to historians, when in these texts you saw that Pharaoh had this for dinner, especially when talking about poetry, it's like, for example, if in English, I believe we have this expression where if somebody is powerful, you would say, he would have him for dinner or have him for lunch. And I'm not sure if that's correct, but there's some expression like that in English as well. So in the Egyptian times, this was also the case. And throughout this is a part of poetry. It expresses as Pharaoh having so much power that magic, which was considered something very, very dangerous, he would have it for lunch. So pretty much it was saying that Pharaoh had power over everything, and even the most scariest thing, he would have it for lunch. It was nothing for Pharaoh. And we have to remember that for them, the pharaohs were also priests. So then when we go to this incident in Exodus 7, 8 through 13, when the rod is thrown into the ground and it turns into this snake, and Aaron's snake begins to eat the other snake, in Pharaoh's mind, what do you think what was the imagery that was created in Pharaoh's mind? Moses' God is having my magic for lunch. So to him, this would be the very first evidence that Moses' God was the one. There was no other. And we're going to move on here, and we're going to look at the very first plague. So in Exodus 7:17 through 18, it says, Thus says the Lord, by this you shall know that I am the Lord. The whole goal of these plagues was mainly because Pharaoh needed to know who God was. And God was attempting, through these series of plagues, some of which were very, very, very scary, to let him know who he was. And when we apply this to our own lives, many times when we talk about trials or the demonstration of God's power, we forget that everything is designed for us to know who God really is. And when we come to the end of our struggles and there's nothing else that we can do, we remember God, and this is how God becomes evident to us. So it says, Thus says the Lord, by this you shall know that I am the Lord. Behold, I will strike the waters which are in the river, and the rod that is in my hand, and they shall be turned into blood. And of course, for the Egyptians at that time, water is a commodity. And when we go to places where water is not available, you begin to realize that water is very important, especially in Southern California. I mean, you go there, it's very, very dry, and water is a commodity. And to them, being in the desert at that particular point in time, where the Nile River still was very big, water was very precious. And for the Nile River to actually turn into blood was a huge deal. And the other thing is that for them, the Nile River was also a symbol of birth. It was very tied to fertility. And then when we go to the very next plague, we have the frog plague. And in Exodus 8, 1 through 4, it says, So the river shall bring forth frogs abundantly. So we see that the river now was tied with this frog, which also, by the way, was also a god that they used to worship. So the river shall bring forth frogs abundantly, which shall go up and come into your house, into your bedroom, on your bed, into the house of your servants and your people, into your ovens, and into your kneading bowls. This was going to be something which was going to be completely horrible. And to me, the way that Exodus paints this picture, frogs coming into your bed. I mean, it is bad enough that, when you're sleeping and a mosquito comes into your room somehow, it's the most annoying thing. So you can imagine their god, the frog, is now everywhere and is actually messing up with their sleep. So they're sleep deprived, and now we come to the lice. And verses 16 through 17, it says, and they did so. Aaron stretched out his hand with his rod and struck the dust of the earth, and it became lice on men and beasts. All the dust of the land became lice throughout all the land of Egypt. So it was very bad. And then right after this, we come to flies. Now, flies, we're not too sure about the lice, but we know for a fact that the fly was also a god that they also worshipped. And in verse 20 through 22, it says, I will send swarms of flies on you and on your servants and your people, and into your houses. The houses of the Egyptians shall be full of swarms of flies, and also the ground which they stand. So very, very bad things, and very gross. I mean, having flies all over the place. And then we finally come to the cattle plague. And also, if you just go ahead and do a quick Google search and you go through some of the ruins, you will see that the cattle were actually very, very important as well. And it says, behold, the hand of the Lord will be on your cattle, in the field, on the horses, and on the donkeys, on the camels, on the oxen, and on the sheep, a very severe pestilence. So we can start getting a picture how God is zeroing on to Pharaoh and trying to convey to him that his gods are completely powerless when it comes to this. And then finally, God begins to touch them. Up until now, it has just been the water, has just been some very, very bad inconveniences. I mean, you've had the past, but now it begins to touch them physically. And that's when we come to the boils. In Exodus 9, 8 through 9, it says, and it will become fine dust in all the land of Egypt, and it will cause boils that break out in sores on man and beast throughout all the land. So just picture this. You had all of these other inconveniences, and now you have these sores and boils. And then after that comes the hail. And in verse 22, and Moses stretched out his rod toward heaven, and the Lord sent thunder and hail, and fire darted to the ground, and the Lord rained hail on the land of Egypt. There's actually a text where one of the priests actually describes some of these plagues, and the way that hail is described is as rocks falling from heaven. And this is how they describe hail, which was very uncommon in Egypt at that time. And then finally, we come to the locust. And now in chapter 10, it says, or else if you refuse to let my people go, behold, tomorrow I will bring locusts into your territory. And they shall cover the face of the earth so that no one will be able to see the earth, and they shall eat the residue, what is left, which remains to you from the hail, and they shall eat up every tree which grows up for you out of the field. How do you feel when you've planted a very nice garden? And I mean, we don't have a lot of pests here, but when the deer come and actually wipe out your hard-earned produce. You want to kill the deer. Before they're cute, but now you want to kill them. So you can imagine this was a society that was dependent on the food that they grew, and God sends them a pest that shows them that even though they have worked out, their crops, God still has the power to send a pest and to just nullify every single effort that they have put into all of this. So now things are becoming serious. But I would like us to pause a little bit on the darkness one, because usually, when I would look at these plagues, I would look at, the lice and all of that. You're like, these are pretty huge. Maybe the crops getting eaten. Maybe that was very bad. But when we come to the darkness, when we look at a little bit about the history, we see that the darkness was actually perhaps the last two plagues were perhaps one of the most terrifying ones for the Egyptians. And we'll see why in a minute. So in Exodus 10:21 through 22, it says, "So Moses stretched out his hand toward heaven, and there was thick darkness in all the land of Egypt 3 days." So what would darkness mean for an Egyptian at that time? So what they would actually believe is that when you look at their art, especially in the tombs, we realize two important things. The first one is that when you go, digging there for, some of the ancient relics, you come to find out that you usually do not find their actual homes. They're almost non-existent. But where you find all of the history is in their tombs, which tells us two things. And the first one is that they valued the afterlife more than the life that they were currently living. So, they would preserve their dead people. They would have all of these stories in their tombs. All of their goods and their possessions were actually placed there in the tomb. So they valued, the afterlife a lot. But the other thing that they believed is that they had this kind of god, which was a snake, right? And this snake was the bad one. And during the night, they believed that when the sun set, the sun god would actually go to the underworld, and he would actually go to fight this snake god, right? So he would go down to fight the snake god, and if he was successful, which he always was, according to their beliefs, if he was successful, he would come up, and then the sun would rise again. So remember, they had the sun god, so if the sun came out, it meant that the sun god was actually successful. So if he didn't come up, it meant that their god had actually been wiped out by this snake entity. And this was very ingrained into their beliefs, that when the darkness comes to them, how many days do they have darkness? They have three days. They have darkness. You can imagine their terror, because the sun god has gone to the underworld. He's fighting this snake entity, because if the snake entity wins, there will be chaos. And then what happens? First day, sun has not come out. And of course, they start getting very, very afraid, because they know that at least for that day, the sun god, which was the main one for them, has actually been conquered. And there's the second day. And still, the sun god is still conquered. And of course, by the third day, the Egyptians are losing it, and Pharaoh is losing it as well. And what is the very next plague? The very next one comes to the firstborn. And in Exodus 11, 4 through 7, it says, "Then Moses said, 'Thus says the Lord, about midnight,'" very significant as well, "'about midnight I will go out in the midst of Egypt, and all the firstborn in the land shall die, from the firstborn of Pharaoh, who sits on his throne, even to the firstborn of the female servant, who is behind the handmill, and all the firstborn of the animals.'" Crazy things, right? And God makes it a point and says that this is going to happen right at midnight, right when the Egyptians are very, very afraid. Now, when we're going to go to this picture right here, and this is what you find in some of the temples there, and this is what they would call kind of like a false door. And the whole point of this was that this was what they considered to be a portal between the world of the living and the world of the dead. And this was a fake door, so as you can see, you have all the door. You have several door frames, and that's the very last door. It does not open, and to them, this was just a portal where you would put this door, and on the doorpost, you would have instructions for the dead on how you can come and go back. If you did not have that door, they believed that then the spirit of the dead would be all confused and would be lost. So you needed to have that door. And what they would also do is, remember, they were very afraid of the night, because imagine, when you're sleeping, the sun god and all the other gods hop on this little boat, on this little canoe thing, right? And they're fighting in the underworld to make sure that they can go ahead and get that snake entity so that the snake can be changed so that the sun can come back in the morning. So you can imagine that the night was not something that was very pleasant for them. It was something that was very terrifying. And what they would usually do is that on their doorposts, they would put a lot of, magic spells, for the gods to protect them during the night. However, when God calls Moses and he says that they need to go ahead and put the blood of the lamb where? They had to put the blood of the lamb on the doorpost. And it is very possible that some of the Israelites might have also given in to some of these, to some of the Egyptian religion. And what God was actually asking them is that now the one who was going to be protecting them was going to be whom? The one that was going to be protecting them now was going to be the blood of the lamb. Nothing else was going to be able to save them. And this was very significant to them. That is why when we look at some of the Egyptians, if you remember, there were some Egyptians that saw the plagues and they saw, look, Pharaoh seems to be very stubborn, but we see that the gods, the sun god and all the other gods are definitely losing. It might be a good idea to go to the house of the Hebrews, get circumcised, and be in a house that is actually protected by the blood of that lamb. And a lot of them actually went there as well. And what we also find is that what they would actually do and actually place in front of those doors, if you remember, if any of you saw that movie that we used to see when we were kids, the Ten Commandments, movie, do you remember that little board game that they had at some part of the scene? There was this little board game that they were playing, and it had little pebbles, right? So this was a game that actually existed, and this game was kind of like chess, and it was almost exclusively played by nobility, right, and the priests. And the Egyptians would actually get this little board game, and they would place it in the doors, in their doorposts. And the whole idea was that if they placed that game in the doorpost, the gods, while they're fighting, remember the snake entity, because the snake entity always wanted to take over, they would actually put this game so the gods could actually entertain themselves and keep guard of their house until the sun actually came out. So doorposts were very important. So now God comes along, and in Exodus 12, he tells them that now the blood of the lamb has to be placed there. And not only that, there was a whole process to this. The lamb had actually needed to be inside the house. They needed to make a bond with the lamb. And once they had done this, then they were supposed to sacrifice the lamb, eat the lamb, but before they had to put the blood on the doorpost. And all of this to show the Israelites that had been influenced by this Egyptian religion that nothing else could save them but God. Nothing else. Their trust, as the Egyptians, it was on material things and on their false gods, but when God taught them this lesson, it was also for the Israelites at that time, that God was the one that was actually going to save them. And this was a very difficult process for them, because even when they come close to the land of Canaan, what happened when they were ready to come in? Again, they lose their trust in God. They look at the reality, which the land had giants, and they become very afraid. They decide that they're not going to trust in God, so it was a very, very difficult process. But one of the things that we learned from the story of Pharaoh was that the only way that we can learn to trust in God is when God begins to remove the pieces and the objects that we trust a lot. And when he removes those, and there's nothing else that you and I can trust in, and that's when we go back to God and begin to call on his name. So may the Lord help us that as we look at the things that we trust, let us ask ourselves if there's anything specific that you and I are trusting in that seems very natural to trust in. Usually God will take that and he will remove it. And when he removes it, we're only going to be left with God. And as God is doing this with us, let's remember that it's only a process, so we can eventually come to the point where we can trust completely in him and even trust him with our lives. Amen?